A teen's big move across the country has now morphed into a terrifying mystery for her family. Morgan Bauer, 19, was last heard from on February 29, but has gone silent since. The teen had recently relocated to Atlanta from her hometown of Aberdeen, South Dakota. She wanted to be her own person, move to a big city, and spread her wings. Sherry Sischmeller, Morgan's mother, told Dateline, "For her to go completely silent on all counts is not her." The teen caught a ride from Aberdeen to Minnesota with a friend, and then hopped on a flight bound for Atlanta on February 12, according to Atlanta police. Morgan's mother says her daughter had arranged to stay with a man she met on Craigslist, offering to clean and do other chores in exchange for rent until she settled into a job. "I didn't want her to really go to Atlanta. It was something that was really worrying me. But Morgan does everything 100%. She's a go big kind of girl," Sherry told Dateline. Then things began going awry. Morgan was allegedly kicked out of her temporary home. Determined not to return to Aberdeen, the teen checked into a motel and did what she could for money. Although Morgan had experience as a waitress, she turned to dancing at a local club for money, her mother says. Officials have been unable to confirm which clubs she may have worked at, but several of the businesses told Morgan's family that, while she had inquired about work, she did not have the correct paperwork at the time. "She was really in survival mode, and that's what is scaring me," Sherry told Dateline. "Who doesn't want to make it at 19 and hasn't made a not-so-great choice? But for her to be off the radar like this is scary." Morgan, who normally is very active on her social media accounts and is always in contact with her best friend, suddenly went mute. The teen stopped replying to her family and friends, with the last activity on her Snapchat account the night she vanished. Her phone has since either died or been turned off. Atlanta police are investigating, but have not commented regarding any leads that may have been phoned in. While officials say foul play is not suspected, authorities have echoed the family's idea that they just want to be sure Morgan is safe. "She isn't in trouble. Just please, if you have the ability to contact and reach someone, do it," said Sherry. "But I have this feeling maybe she doesn't have that opportunity because of whatever has happened to her." Sherry and her husband have traveled to Atlanta to pound the pavement with flyers, including Morgan's photo. Thousands have offered support and encouragement online. Morgan's story and image have reportedly reached hundreds of thousands of people, as well as been captured on the front page of Imgur. Members in the Facebook group Missing Morgan have topped 5,500 members. But with the attention that Sherry says the family is so very grateful for, there come, at times, harsh words and rumors. While Sherry says she wants to thank each and every person sharing Morgan's story and image, she has a message for those posting unkind words. This isn't a story about a girl who was asking for it, or who should have known better. This is about a girl who is missing and needs to come home safely, says Sherry. It doesn't matter. She's worth everything and is so loved. FBI agents and local police raided a home in Georgia in search of human remains in the 2016 disappearance of Morgan, who was last seen in a mysterious video that she posted to Instagram. A search warrant obtained based on credible information was executed at a property on South Broad Street in the Atlanta suburb of Porterdale. To make ends meet, Bauer took a job as a stripper at a club and was bouncing between motels in the metro Atlanta area. Police initially believed that she went missing after finishing a shift at the strip club on February 25, 2016. Bauer's last sighting was on February 26, when she posted a video of herself on Instagram walking in Porterdale Yellow River Park. The park is less than a mile from the property that was raided by the FBI. A man can be seen following Bauer in the recording, which was the last thing she ever shared on social media. A $10,000 reward for information on Morgan's disappearance was offered in 2019. In August of 2023, authorities announced the arrest of 2 people in connection with the February 2016 disappearance of Morgan Bauer. A man named Jonathan Warren was arrested in California and charged with murder, aggravated assault, concealing a death, and tampering with evidence. A woman named Caitlin Globe was arrested in Illinois and charged with concealing a death and tampering with evidence. Their connection to Morgan is unclear at this time. Morgan has still not been found. On Saturday, August 16, 1975, in the pre-dawn hours, a police sergeant in a suburb near Salt Lake City, Utah, pulled over a tan Volkswagen Beetle he deemed suspicious. Inside the car, he found a handsome man in his late 20s, wearing a turtleneck. Upon searching the vehicle, police discovered an ominous assemblage of items that included a ski mask, an ice pick, and a pair of handcuffs. Investigators identified that man as Theodore Ted Bundy. He later confessed to having killed more than 24 young women, most of whom were strangers to him. On that same day, in Marple Township, which sits about 6 miles west of the Philadelphia-Delaware County border, nobody had yet heard of Ted Bundy. There was no social media. 24-hour news cycles were still 20 years away. And even if those things had existed, authorities hadn't yet connected Bundy to his horrific trajectory of rape, torture, murder, and necrophilia. They were just beginning what would become a lengthy and disturbing investigation into the man. In Marple, police had their own chilling investigation going on. The day before, 8-year-old Gretchen Harrington had departed her Cape Cod-style home on Lawrence Road, tidy blonde pigtails, dancing in the summer air, to walk to Vacation Bible School. The VBS sessions started at Trinity Christian Reformed Church, about a half-mile up the road. They continued at nearby Brummel Reformed Presbyterian Church. Gretchen's dad, Harold, had served as pastor there since moving his family from western Pennsylvania in 1968. A child walking alone on a sunny summer day in a place like Marple was hardly unusual. Such a thing wasn't perceived as having even the faintest whiff of risk. This was the 70s, in a leafy suburb. Kids played freeze tag and sardines and Red Rover outside till all hours. They played on the streets, in the dark and in the woods. They cooled off in Darby Creek, which ran behind Gretchen's home, without a care in the world. Kids walked to their friends' houses blocks away. No cell phones or GPS watches to tether them to their parents. There were no bike helmets to be found. Marple was as safe could be. That's why many longtime Philadelphians moved there in the 60s. But Gretchen's solo excursion actually was unusual for her. On any other day, she'd have been walking to VBS with her 2 sisters, Zoe and Harriet, known as Anne. Gretchen's sisters were a few years older than her. Walking together was their routine. On this particular day, though, their mom, Ina, was bringing home her newborn baby, Jessica, and Zoe and Anne opted to stay home and wait for their arrival. Pastor Harrington encouraged Gretchen to go to VBS to keep up her perfect attendance record. So Gretchen was all alone as her father waved goodbye to her. She began her stroll up the hill to Trinity just after 9 a.m. Later that morning, apparently sometime around 11 a.m., Harold learned that Gretchen had never made it to her destination. He spoke with Trinity's pastor, David Zanstra, and Zanstra's wife, Margie, both of whom worked in the VBS program. David Zanstra called the police at Harold's request. The Harringtons and Zanstras knew each other well. The 2 families lived close to one another. Both dads were in the same line of work. And both moms filled the stereotypical role of pastor's wife. One of Zanstra's daughters was Gretchen's best friend. As the sun set that day just before 8 p.m., there was still no sign of Gretchen. Margie brought supper to the Harrington home, where Ina seemed resigned to the fact that she would never see her daughter alive again. She was just kind of accepting of the fact that Gretchen was gone, Margie said in an interview years later. I don't know whether she was just putting on a brave face. I think she was in shock. By Saturday, hundreds of people were involved in the search for Gretchen. A Pennsylvania State Police helicopter buzzed the area continuously. Paul Barton, who lived in nearby Newtown Square, heard about the search on his police scanner while he was floating in his backyard pool. He soon drove down to Darby Creek to join a search team. His group combed a grassy hill that's now the site of a giant supermarket, a stone's throw west of the Blue Route, which was under construction at the time. There was just this very solemn feeling among all of us who were out there searching. Barton recalls, "We went out there not knowing what to expect, what we might find. We were looking for something, anything, but we found nothing. Nobody did." That Sunday, just 2 days after the mystery surrounding Gretchen had begun, police called off the large-scale search operation. Investigators had little to go on. The police chief told a local newspaper, "We haven't got a clue." The town went into full-blown panic mode. Friends and family members began handing out flyers to passing motorists in the area. The flyers showed Gretchen in her most recent school photo, sporting a missing tooth and a childish grin. So much speculation, so many unanswered questions. Had she run away? Did she drown in the creek? Did a stranger abduct her? Was it somebody she knew? A few days after Gretchen disappeared, my mom made me get my hair cut real short so that I would look like a boy. She didn't want me to stand out with long hair, recalls Karen Franks Zetterberg, a Bible school classmate of Gretchen's, who was the same age and lived in the same tightly knit neighborhood. Before Gretchen disappeared, Franks Zetterberg regularly walked to school, her piano lessons and the swim club. But life changed for good following the incident. I never walked alone anywhere again after that. All the searching produced no useful clues of any kind. August turned into September. Zoe and Ann Harrington returned to Delaware County Christian School. The other kids at school didn't talk to them because they didn't know what to say. September became October, as Halloween decorations began to adorn neighborhood houses. Still nothing. Then, on October 14, 2 months after Gretchen walked up that hill, a jogger in Ridley Creek State Park, about 20 minutes from Gretchen's home, stumbled on skeletonized human remains. At first, he wasn't sure what he had found, until he saw what was clearly a fingernail. He ran to fetch a park ranger. Gretchen's parents confirmed that the distinctive clothing found with the remains was hers. Ina made the girls' wardrobes by hand. The medical examiner positively identified the body as Gretchen's using dental records. The manner of death, homicide. The cause, someone had fractured her skull with multiple vicious blows. Police suspected sexual assault, though the autopsy revealed no evidence of that. The Sunday after Gretchen's body was located, Harold took to the pulpit and delivered a heart-wrenching sermon. "Gretchen, with her simple faith in Christ, is free," he declared. "But her murderer is in terrible bondage. The world is filled with unspeakable evil because of the wickedness of the human who knows the truth but will not accept it." The discovery in the woods led to a new frenzy of activity in the case. Witnesses came forward with reports of men of various descriptions they'd seen in the area where Gretchen was found. Police received numerous tips, some sounding more promising, some completely frivolous. Investigators looked into a series of potential suspects, including several known sex offenders living in the area. But nothing led to an arrest, and the evidence box at the headquarters of the Marple Township Police Department, with reel-to-reel tape interviews, photographs, and memoranda packed inside, began collecting dust, as it would for decades to come. Nick Coffin can't remember exactly what day it happened, but it was sometime last fall. He was sitting at Marple Township Police Headquarters. He's a sergeant. When he heard the voicemail. Naturally, when detectives retire or pass away, other cops inherit their cold cases. In the case of Gretchen Harrington, Coffin became the guy. So when a woman called Marple Police last fall and wanted to talk to somebody about Gretchen, Her message went to Coffin's phone. The woman said she thought she knew who'd murdered Gretchen and talked about an attempted kidnapping around the same time. She also mentioned that she kept a diary in the 1970s in which she recorded some of this information when she was a 10-year-old girl living in Havertown, about 3 miles east of Marple. The woman still had the diary in her possession all these years later. Coffin got in touch with Pennsylvania State Police. Though the case remained open with the Marple cops because Gretchen had last been seen in their jurisdiction, the state police technically became the lead investigatory agency once the remains were found in the state park. Besides, I have 4 detectives in my division, Coffin notes. The state police have so many more resources. State troopers scheduled an interview with the woman. She is designated in court documents only by her initials S, F, and confidential informant number 1. The interview would turn out to be a monumental development in a cold case that had been open for nearly half a century. And monumental developments in decades-old cold cases almost never happen. The woman told the state troopers that she had been childhood friends with one of the Zanstraw daughters. She frequently slept over at their house. During one of those sleepovers, when she was 10, she told the troopers she awoke in the middle of the night to find Pastor Zanstra touching her groin area. She shifted her position, and he immediately hurried from the room. The next night, he touched her there again, she said. When the girls woke up the following morning, the woman says she mentioned the dad's odd behavior to the daughter, and the daughter told her something to the effect of, "He does that sometimes." When the girl related the incidents to her parents, they told her she wasn't allowed to sleep over at the Zanstra house anymore. Notably, police believe the incident in question occurred exactly 1 week before Gretchen vanished. The woman also told state police about another child in the neighborhood, with whom she was friends, a girl named Holly. According to the confidential informant, somebody had attempted to abduct Holly. She wrote the following entry in her diary, which she turned over to the state troopers earlier this year. Guess what? A man tried to kidnap Holly twice. It's a secret, so I can't tell anyone, but I think he might be the one who kidnapped Gretchen. I think it was Mr. Z. She confirmed to the troopers that the Z stood for Zanstra. Bizarrely, though, and in an investigatory gap apparently never explained by Marple police, Zanstra was able to give an accurate and detailed description of the homemade shorts Gretchen was wearing that day, even though he supposedly hadn't seen her. The original Marple detective in her case died in June of 2020. This past June, state troopers tracked Zanstra down to a lakefront home in Marietta, Georgia. He and his wife had moved there after he'd retired in the mid-aughts. Zanstra agreed to meet the troopers at the headquarters of the Cobb County Police on July 17. The troopers questioned Zanstra about Gretchen's disappearance, and he reiterated to them that he hadn't seen her that day. Then they revealed the newest allegations to him, that the minister had sexually assaulted his daughter and her best friend. A criminal complaint filed in Delaware County against Zanstra soon after that meeting states that he immediately admitted to the sexual assaults and to seeing Gretchen the day she went missing. He told the troopers he offered her a ride and that she accepted. But when it became clear VBS wasn't his destination, Gretchen asked him to take her home. Instead, he said he took her to a wooded area and demanded that she take off her clothes. She refused. Then he attacked her. He claims he struck her in the head with his fist, and that this ended her life. He said he checked for a pulse and believed her to be dead, so he covered her half-naked body with sticks in the woods and went back to his life. The Pennsylvania State Police wouldn't comment for this story, citing the fact that it's an open investigation. But Phil Stoddard, a detective in Marietta, Georgia, who sat in on the Zanstra interview, told a TV news crew there that Zanstra was emotionless during his confession to the troopers. As of press time, Zanstra was sitting in a Georgia correctional facility, awaiting extradition to Delaware County on charges of kidnapping and homicide. His lawyer didn't respond to multiple requests for comment. As much as Zanstra's confession brought closure regarding Gretchen's fate, It also raised a serious question with reverberations from coast to coast. Did this man who has admitted killing one girl and sexually abusing 2 others have other victims? Before coming to live in Marple, Zandstra was the pastor of a now-defunct church in Flanders, New Jersey, for several years. While at Trinity, he campaigned against the teaching of sex education in the local school district. Less than a year after Gretchen's remains were found, he moved his family to a church in Plano, Texas, just outside Dallas, where he led the congregation for 7 years. After that, it was off to the Living Faith Community Church in San Diego until 1990. Zandstra's final church was in Fairfield, California, a post he retired from in 2005, when he was 65. That's a lot of years of power and access to the young and vulnerable. A spokesperson for the Christian Reformed Church in North America, the religious organization under which all of Zandstra's churches were governed, tells Philly Mag that it knows of no other allegations against Zandstra, but is in communication with his previous congregations regarding him. Police in California recently announced that they're looking into whether Zandstra might have abducted Amanda Nicole Nikki Campbell, a 4-year-old girl last seen riding her bike alone to a friend's house in 1991. Zandstra and Campbell lived just minutes from each other. Investigators in Georgia have now collected a DNA sample from Zandstra to potentially aid in investigations of missing persons, sexual assault, and murder nationwide. The case in Delaware County is getting a ton of attention, a spokesperson for the Cobb County District Attorney stated. And this is the kind of case where the more people hear about it, the more people could come forward. While the Marple community now has some of the answers it's been seeking for all these decades, many of the residents we spoke to haven't found peace in this shocking turn of events. It was much easier to believe that some outsider had done this, some deranged itinerant sex offender who had somehow wandered into town, snatched up a young girl, and then disappeared just as quickly, taking his evil with him to whatever unfortunate place he landed next. Instead, police say it was a respected member of their community, a religious leader with a wife and young girls of his own, a wife who'd brought supper to the family of the girl he's confessed to murdering the very day he says he killed her. The killing of 22-year-old Eileen Cotter in North London remained unsolved for nearly 50 years. She was found strangled in courtyard next to a block of garages behind Hamilton Park in Finsbury Park just after 2 p.m. on the 1st of June, 1974. Her underwear and tights had been pulled down and her handbag, glasses, and shoes were missing. A post-mortem examination concluded she died of manual strangulation and had a black eye and bruising from being hit in the face. Eileen was a known sex worker who lived in North London, and the garages were known to be used for prostitution. Detectives spoke to 92 potential suspects and deployed police officers as decoys to draw out predatory men in the area, but nobody was ever charged. DNA samples were taken from her body and entered onto the police database. It was not until February 2019 that South African suspect John Appelgren, then 78, was arrested for a domestic assault on his third wife. He accepted a police caution over the offense, and his DNA sample was matched to those recovered from Eileen's body. Detectives then carried out further investigation to build a timeline of events to prove that only Appelgren could have been the killer. Appelgren told police in interview that he was living in Leighton, East London, at the time of the killing, and denied going to the Hamilton Park garages or any knowledge of Eileen Cotter. Faced with the DNA evidence, he later admitted having sex with Eileen, but denied killing her. On 22nd of June 2022, he was arrested and charged with murder. Appelgren went on trial at the Old Bailey in May 2023, with the prosecution arguing that he had sex with Eileen before he strangled her and pushed her dead body out of his car and drove away. The court heard the killing took place 6 weeks after the birth of his first child with his ex-wife Anne. She told police that he once used both of his hands to apply force to her neck. On June 16, 2023, he was cleared of murder, but convicted of manslaughter. He was also convicted of indecently assaulting a young woman at the reception for his wedding to Anne on October 14, 1972. She did not make a complaint at the time, but disclosed it to police during the investigation launched in 2019. Appelgren was sentenced to 10.5 years imprisonment, meaning he will be eligible for release on parole after 5 years and 3 months. Eileen's brother Patrick Cotter stated, "The impact the death of my sister had on my life is almost indescribable, but I will try to put it into words. I was 5 years old at the time. Eileen and I shared the same father, but Eileen's mother had passed away, therefore my mother cared for her. No one in my family ever spoke to me about my sister's murder. I have no memory of her funeral, and I have no idea whether she was buried or cremated, and no idea where she was laid to rest. As a result, I have never been able to visit her grave." Detective Chief Inspector Lawrence Smith said, "Eileen tragically died at a young age after being raped and badly beaten, with her body then discarded on the street. When my team reviewed the original investigation, we were impressed by how thorough it was. Investigators at the time used every available method to find the suspect, including operations with decoy women. This was a tactic used at the time where female police officers under protection were placed at the scenes of crimes in efforts to draw out predatory men. Unfortunately, they did not have the science available to us now, and although he should have been in prison decades ago, her killer has now been brought to justice." Pink roses reminiscent of the ones Georgie Cannaday would pick alongside the dirt road near her rural J home were laid on her headstone on Friday as the family and law enforcement officers gathered in honor of a woman whose homicide was finally solved. The decomposing remains of Georgie Cannaday, 48, were found wrapped up in a rug in an upstairs bedroom of her rural J home on June 28, 1973. A recently found autopsy report showed she died by strangulation. The Delaware County Cold Case Unit closed Cannaday's case last month after interviewing new witnesses as well as re-interviewing old witnesses. Investigators were able to positively identify 2 men they now say are Cannaday's killers. Both suspects are deceased. We have some unanswered questions. Like, what was the motive for her death? Robbery certainly wasn't, said Mark Wall, Delaware County Cold Case Detective. Cannaday's purse was found near her body containing money and personal papers. One of the suspects, who was a juvenile at the time, led a life of crime using strangulation as his MO, Wall said. The family gathered at the Xena Cemetery, a country graveyard in rural northeastern Oklahoma, where Cannaday was buried 50 years ago, near her father, George Cannaday. They told stories and talked about the woman they remember as their sweet aunt. She loved children, and she could make the best peach cobbler, said Gary Dubois. After the gravesite remembrance service, Gary was just a young woman when Georgie was killed. She was married to George's nephew, Charles. George's niece, Wanda Forster, also spoke about memories of her beloved aunt. She just loved children, Forster said. In some ways, she was a child herself. Georgie lived alone in the house her father left her when he died, just 3 months before her murder. She rarely left home, and most people considered Georgie a recluse. Delaware County Sheriff James Beck, Cold Case Director Stephanie Bishop, and Detective Wall met with the family prior to the memorial service to answer as many questions about the case as they could. The most pressing question on their minds: what are the names of the suspects? While investigators are currently not able to release the names of the 2 suspects because they are deceased, Sheriff Beck says he understands the family's frustration of not knowing the killers' names. But it's really satisfying to know after 50 years, said Wall. We know who committed the crime, and we know how it was committed, and it gives the family a little bit of peace. I hope, knowing that it's solved. Even though the individuals have passed away, they're probably still paying for their crime. Bishop, who volunteers her time on the cold case squad, also spoke with the family about the search for missing evidence in the case, like the rug used to wrap George's body in. We will regroup in several months, and we may have the family sign confidentiality releases before releasing the names of both suspects, Bishop said. Family members thanked the cold case team for their work. After the service, Detective Wall escorted George's family to the old family homestead to view the home where Cannaday lost her life. Named after her father, George Cannaday, Georgie was the baby of the family and was loved by everyone. As the family said their goodbyes at the gravesite, pink roses, her favorite, were placed on her headstone. Alicia Navarro disappeared from their home in Glendale, Arizona on September 15, 2019. At the time, as the coronavirus spreads at a rapid pace across the world, Alicia's mom, Jessica Nuez, said she is even more terrified for her daughter's safety. "We just need to find her, and I need to know that she is safe," Jessica said tearfully. "My girl is out there alone, without me, and now this virus, it's horrible. I just need her back home." Jessica said she is especially worried because her daughter is on the autism spectrum and is known to be shy or anxious in some social situations. She takes medicine and has a compromised immune system. Jessica is worried Alicia's anxiety will also overwhelm her with the current situation. In the very early hours of September 15, 2019, Jessica saw her daughter for the last time. It was around 1 a.m. and Jessica was waiting for her husband to get off work. Alicia came down for a glass of water and then returned to her room. She was really big into gaming, Jessica said. She would stay up later playing games online and talking to friends. "I didn't think anything of it. It seemed safe to me." Later that same morning, around 7 a.m., Jessica made breakfast for her husband and her two youngest children, Alicia's younger brother and sister. Alicia was not up yet. That's when Jessica noticed the back door was open. When she checked the backyard, she discovered several chairs next to a wall at the edge of their backyard. Jessica had a sinking feeling that Alicia used them to jump over the wall. She checked her daughter's bedroom. Alicia was gone. A short time later, Jessica found a note on Alicia's desk that read, "I ran away. I will be back. I swear. I'm sorry." Alicia's laptop was also gone, but the chargers were left behind in her room. Jessica told Dateline this was out of character for Alicia and immediately called police. She told Dateline she was extremely worried, but assumed the teen would be back in a few days. "We're past the 6-month mark now," Jessica said. "Where is she?" Alicia isn't a high-demand girl, according to her mother. She likes to wear the same clothes and the same shoes over and over, which her mother says is because of her autism. She only wore sweatshirts in Arizona, despite the harsh heat. Alicia wasn't fond of being out in public much, or for very long. She did, however, like going to McDonald's, where her mother said she'd been eating chicken nuggets for years. She had just started the school year at Bourgade Catholic High School, and her anxiety had peaked for several days. But Jessica said her daughter never expressed being unhappy at home. "She's a sweet girl and loves her family, and she loves to read and play video games," Jessica said, adding that the online gaming may have led to her disappearance. Jessica stated she fears an online predator from one of Alicia's games may have lured her away. "I just feel like she's in danger. She would have never been gone this long, not without getting in touch with me," Jessica said. "Someone has her and I'm so worried." Jessica said her first goal is to find her daughter, and her second goal is to warn parents about monitoring their children's social media and online activity. "It could be the difference in life or death for your child," Jessica said. "Please monitor everything they do." I don't want anyone to go through the same nightmare I'm going through." The Glendale Police Department told Dateline it is not known at this time if Alicia was lured away or if she left on her own, but they are continuing to search for her and said they could use the public's help for new information. Detectives have been working diligently on bringing Alicia home safely and as quickly as possible. Glendale Police Sergeant Randy Stewart told Dateline she had no known means of providing for herself, which means she would need to rely on others and on the street. That can be very dangerous. Both family and police have pointed out that Alicia may appear younger due to her small stature and her autism. The longer Alicia's away from home, the more at risk of exploitation she is due to her age, stature, and autism, Stewart added. The Glendale Police Department is now working with the FBI and the Center for Missing and Exploited Children on the case. A silver alert has been issued in Arizona, and police continue to follow all leads and tips as they come in. A Facebook page called Finding Alicia Navarro has been created for anyone wanting to discuss the case or provide information that may lead to her whereabouts. "I still have hope that my Alicia will be found," Jessica said. "It's hard, so hard, but I always have to have that hope. And if anyone has seen her, I beg you to let someone know. I just hope this nightmare will be over soon." Alicia, who turned 15 on September 20, 2019, has brown eyes, brown hair, and braces. She is 4'5" and weighs 95 pounds. She may be wearing a sweatshirt, a whitewashed denim overall skirt, and black and white Vans type sneakers, and carrying a silver Apple MacBook Pro laptop. The search for 14-year-old Alicia Navarro, who disappeared from the Phoenix area in September of 2019, came to an end in July of 2023 when the young woman, now 18, reported to a police station in Montana. She is by all accounts safe. She is by all accounts healthy. And she is by all accounts happy. Jose Santiago, a spokesman for the Glendale Police Department, told reporters at a news conference. The case is still under investigation, and the details about how Alicia got to Montana remained unclear. Police confirmed that no arrests have been made in connection to the case, and no one has been detained or in custody. 4 people were interviewed after a search warrant was served at a home, but no other information was released. This is still an active investigation, and we are requesting time and patience as we peel away the layers of the last 4 years, said Officer Gina Wynn with Glendale PD. "Miracles do exist, and always hope and always fight," said Jessica Nunez, Alicia's mother. According to police in Havre, Montana, a town located near the U.S.-Canadian border, Alicia walked into the town's police station, saying she wanted to be taken off the missing persons list. Trent Steele, president of a group named the Anti-Predator Project, said Alicia wanted to get her ID and other documents. Nunez reunited with Alicia on July 26 via a video call. Questions, however, remain as to what Alicia has been doing since she disappeared in 2019. "There's still a lot of moving parts, a lot of moving pieces," said Steele. "I think information is probably going to continue to come out for the next weeks, months, maybe even years." On July 28, we spoke with a man named Jeffrey Hummert. He said he recognized Alicia in the news, claiming to have seen her in June 2022. "It was like a light bulb turned on in my head," said Hummert. "All the gears started turning, and everything started coming back together." Hummert said he was working on a project at a city park when he noticed the teen. "I didn't talk to her anything like that, but it was mainly she was sitting at the gazebo," Hummert said. Alicia wore black clothing with a blue jacket. Alicia sat by herself, eating lunch before walking off with a plastic Walmart bag. A young college student who was brutally killed on a Prescott hiking trail decades ago was the victim of a serial predator who took his own life years later, authorities said in August of this year. Yavapai County Sheriff David Rhodes announced at a news conference that DNA evidence indicates Brian Scott Bennett was the man responsible for 23-year-old Cathy Sposito's 1987 death. Early on the morning of June 13, 1987, 23-year-old Cathy Sposito set out on a hike along Thumb Butt Trail in Prescott, Arizona. During the trek, others heard her scream and rushed to her aid, only to find her bloodied and dead on the trail. Sposito's murder quickly went cold, but local police have just announced that a serial sexual predator named Brian Scott Bennett was likely her killer. Police believe that Bennett, who was just 16 at the time, hit Sposito with a rock and a wrench, shot her in the eye, and stabbed her in the head before fleeing the scene. According to reports, Sposito was likely Bennett's first victim, but he went on to attack at least 3 other women. In April 1990, Bennett was accused of sexually assaulting another woman on the same trail, at the same time of day as Sposito, as she was camping with her boyfriend. That same year, he allegedly locked a girl in a room during a house party and tried to sexually assault her. And in June 1993, Bennett allegedly kidnapped another woman from a post office in Prescott, sexually assaulted her, and threatened to kill her because she'd seen his face. Though Bennett was arrested for the house party assault and the kidnapping, he was never convicted of anything due to a lack of evidence. In 1994, he moved home to Kentucky and died by suicide. For decades, both Sposito's murder and the sexual assault on Thumb Butt Trail remained cold cases. According to reports, it took a group of volunteers from Yavapai County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit and DNA technology to finally identify Bennett as the perpetrator. In 2020, the Cold Case Unit started to dig into the unsolved 1990 sexual assault. DNA from that case led them to 2 men, brothers, who had lived in the area at the time. Then, the investigators discovered that one of the brothers, Brian Scott Bennett, was tied to other sexual assaults. To be absolutely certain, investigators had Bennett's body exhumed in November 2022. They found that his DNA matched the 1990 sexual assault, and that his DNA also matched some found on the ratchet wrench used to bludgeon Sposito. That said, investigators also found other people's DNA on the wrench, so they haven't yet officially closed Sposito's case. For Renee Sandoval, the woman Bennett kidnapped in 1993, the discovery brings a sense of closure. Sandoval was rescued when police happened to pull over Bennett's car, but she never got to see him convicted for his crime. She thanked the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office for giving credence to her experience and for bringing some peace to Cathy Sposito. The story doesn't entirely end there, however. Investigators suspect that Bennett, given the frequency and consistency of his attacks, could have more victims out there. What we know of serious, violent predators like this is that it is very unlikely, given the frequency in which he was willing to act, that these are the only 4 cases that exist, Rhodes explained. They're appealing to the public to come forward with any information. The man investigators say kidnapped and killed 12-year-old Jennifer Odom as she walked home after stepping off a Pasco County school bus in 1993 may be sentenced to death for the crime. State Attorney Bill Glass made that announcement during a press conference in July of this year, after the Hernando County Sheriff's Office announced it has charged Jeffrey Norman Crum with the kidnapping, murder, and sexual assault of Odom 30 years later. Odom was last seen getting off of a school bus on February 19, 1993, to begin the 200-yard walk to her home in northeastern Pasco County. But she never made it. At the time, a massive manhunt was launched, and every law enforcement agency in the Bay Area was looking for a blue truck that was seen in the area by some of her classmates. Every one of us, including those in law enforcement, can look at Jennifer as our niece, our sister, our granddaughter, and realize that it is a tragedy beyond tragedy," stated Hernando County Sheriff Al Nienhui. The blue truck was the focus of the investigation for the last 30 years, as investigators believed that the driver may have been involved in the abduction. 6 days later, on February 25, Odom's body was found along a horse-riding trails off Powell Road in Hernando County. She had been brutally attacked and murdered. We're not exactly sure how long her abductor kept her captive, or when exactly the murder took place. But we are relatively confident the murder took place in that field sometime. Obviously, prior to her being found, the sheriff stated. 2 years later, on January 5, 1995, a couple hunting for scrap metal in a rural area of Hernando County discovered Jennifer's missing book bag and clarinet case, which had fingerprints on it. Every viable lead for the next 30 years, including those that came from the Pasco County Sheriff Office, or the Florida Department of Law Enforcement or private citizens, was investigated thoroughly, according to Sheriff Nienhuis. 13 months before Odom was abducted, a teenager was kidnapped as she got off a school bus in north central Pasco County. She was brutally attacked and sexually assaulted. Sheriff Nienhuis says she suffered injuries to her head and skull that were very significant, and she was left for dead. She survived, but her life was forever changed. He says she was a true victim. She was not engaged in a high-risk lifestyle and was victimized. Law enforcement was able to get biological material at the time. Since there were similarities between the two girls, detectives believed they may be related. The investigation never stopped, Sheriff Nienhui said. Hundreds of items were tested and retested every time new technology came out in the hopes of finding a smoking gun to solve Odom's murder. Approximately 10 years ago, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reached out to HCSO and offered to scan every piece of paper in Odom's case so it would be readily available. It was more than 75,000 pieces of paper. The biological evidence in Pasco County was tested before February 2015, and detectives got a full DNA profile. However, you need to have someone to match it to in the National DNA Database. Sheriff Nienhui says until 2015, there were no leads on that particular piece of DNA. They compared the DNA to local DNA to see if there were any close matches, which would be a family member. The sheriff says they found the DNA matched the son of the person who turned out to be the suspect. In February 2015, Detective George Lundgren was contacted by a detective from the Pasco County Sheriff's Office, who let him know that they had a solid lead in the original case in which the teen was found alive. They were able to narrow it down to Jeffrey Norman Crum, who quickly became the #1 suspect in the Odom case. I have confidence that we have the right person, and we have the right aggravators in this particular case to treat it as a death penalty case, stated Glass. This is every parent's nightmare. This is the thing that keeps parents up at night worried about their children. Crum was already serving 2 life sentences for the sexual battery and kidnapping case out of Pasco County that was prosecuted around 2015. Hernando County has now charged him with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual battery. Over the last 30 years, countless, literally countless detectives and sworn law enforcement personnel and civilian and tipsters have had a hand in this investigation. Every piece of the mosaic. The minute Crum was identified as a suspect in the Jennifer Odom case, Detective Lundgren went to work putting a mosaic together, or a puzzle. And I can tell you, other than the conviction in the previous case, there was no other piece of the puzzle. That was a big piece of the puzzle. Every other piece of the puzzle that got us to this point were tiny little fragments that gave the state attorney and the grand jury enough confidence to indict Crum, the sheriff said. During the press conference, Sheriff Nienhui showed an old photo of Crum, and he kept reiterating he was not on the investigators' radar until the past few years. The sheriff says, Crum had been arrested in the early 1980s for armed robbery in Hillsborough County. In 1985, he was charged with kidnapping, sexual assault, and false imprisonment in Hillsborough County. He was arrested by Tampa police in 1987 for carrying a concealed weapon. In 1988, he was caught again carrying a concealed weapon and was charged with aggravated assault. In 1998, he was arrested for domestic battery in Hernando County 3 times. In 2001, he was arrested for violation of probation in Hillsborough County. He was arrested a few years later for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon in Hernando County. In 2015, he was arrested in Pasco County for aggravated sexual assault on a child under the age of 12 in Pasco County. "He's a bad individual," Sheriff Nianwi stated. Communities in Pasco and Hernando counties were on edge after Jennifer Odom's kidnapping and murder back then. Jeannie Cameron, the general manager at Papa Joe's Italian restaurant in Brooksville, said she and others in the community remember hearing about her disappearance all too well. "So we all remember hearing about Jennifer's disappearance and about the blue truck, and everybody was on alert about looking," Cameron said. "Back then, 30 years ago as a parent, I was very angry that someone could do something like that to a child and then leave her there in the middle of nowhere," said Joseph Giaratana, the owner of Papa Joe's Italian restaurant. Jessica Ellis said she went to Waitman Middle School with Odom and played in the same clarinet section in band class. "I would say we saw each other a lot. We weren't like close friends, but we knew a lot of the same people. We rode the school bus every day, and I just remember her always being nice," said Ellis, a former classmate. Grief and fear followed in the days, months, and years after Odom's death. It's closure for many in the community who now carry a different perspective. Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office is searching for additional victims. The sheriff said that over the years, a couple of anonymous tips came in that led investigators to believe that there are several people out there with more information about Odom's abduction and murder. And he wants them to come forward. Anyone with information on Odom's kidnapping and murder, or anyone who may be a victim of Crum, is asked to call 352-754-6830 and ask for Detective Lundgren if you do have information on Odom's case. A judge in Florida has ordered a 65-year-old California fugitive held without bond in connection with the murder of a woman 39 years ago. Donald Santini was arrested by U.S. Marshals in California in June and was extradited without protest to the Sunshine State. Authorities said that the suspect has used 13 aliases over the years. Santini was the last person seen with 33-year-old Cynthia Cindy Ruth Wood. The arrest warrant said a medical examiner determined she had been strangled, and Santini's fingerprints were found on her body. You being on the run for almost 40 years is a consciousness of guilt. You knew you were running from something. You are the definition of flight risk, Judge Catherine Catlin told Santini during a hearing in Tampa on Thursday, July 6th. Back in 1984, Santini was known as Charles Michael Stevens, which was an alias he used to flee a warrant in Texas. At the time of his arrest, he was living under the name Wellman Simmons in Campo, California, which is in southeastern San Diego County. Wood met with Santini, who had called her with promises of providing information about her husband, Barry Wood, that could possibly help her win custody of their 2 children, who were 3 and 5, according to previous reports by the Bradenton Herald. Wood also had a son from a previous relationship. Police believe that she was strangled with her body being found in a watery grave 3 days after she was last seen with Santini. Shortly afterwards, he left town. Santini's attorney asked the judge for bail, but prosecutors noted that Santini killed Wood after fleeing a charge in Texas related to a convenience store robbery in which he was accused of stealing $270 while armed with a knife. You have from his very own mouth that he has been on the lam for 39 years, and he purposely has been using fake IDs so that he can avoid law enforcement, Prosecutor Michelle Doherty told the court. The state's attorney's office also said in court that in interviews, Santini referred Wood's death as a contract killing. You are the definition of flight risk, the judge told Santini during the hearing. There is nothing I can do to preserve the safety of this community if I was to let you go. Meanwhile, Santini's public defender, Jamie Kane, said that there's no evidence that the suspect left Texas with an outstanding warrant. Where is the failure to appear warrant? Where is the circuit court case number? Where is the evidence that he was on pretrial release? Other than a simple statement of Mr. Santini, who is not a legal expert, Kane said. Santini was identified by the FBI after he applied for a passport under the name Wellman Simmons. On Thursday, Wood's stepdaughter, Denise Kozer, told the news that she was delighted Santini will be held until trial. He doesn't deserve any freedom. We've had no freedom for 40 years, wondering where he was. And it's been awful, she said. While Florida Gulf Coast law professor Dr. Pamela Say told the station that Santini's assertion that Wood's death was a contract killing could be bad for his defense. A killing for hire is, in many circles, worse than a killing for passion or some other reason. Say also was not sure if the murder constitutes a death penalty case. It depends on the circumstances surrounding it. What were the aggravating circumstances that contributed to the crime? What is it that caused this? And if you're talking about a contract hit, that could be an aggravating circumstance. That you don't want that kind of person out on the street ever again. That's quite possible, Say said. On Saturday, March 29, 1975, 16-year-old teen Sharon Prior left her home to meet up with her friends at the nearby pizzeria. Unfortunately, she never returned home. Sharon was missing for days, and the community had set up search parties to help the police look for the missing teen. Her body was discovered in a field days after her disappearance. Sharon Prior had been brutally murdered. She had been raped, then asphyxiated. Her body had been covered with bruises. Her life had been cut way too short. Decades after her murder, police are still trying to solve the young teen's murder and bring her killer to justice. Sharon Prior was considered a very reliable and friendly teen. At 16 years old, she was 5'3" and weighed 105 pounds. She had blonde hair and blue eyes. Sharon was heavily involved in the boys' and girls' club in her town, where she got to play floor hockey and other sports. She was interested in becoming a veterinarian and attended science and biology courses at the high school. She was very bright and creative. She disappeared after setting out to meet friends at a pizza parlor near her home in Montreal's Pointe St. Charles neighborhood. Her body was found 3 days later in a wooded area in Longwool, on Montreal's South Shore. Sharon died a violent death. She was raped, beaten, and died of asphyxiation. The asphyxiation was caused by blood in her lungs. Police said that she probably hemorrhaged internally when her assailant crushed her chest with his knee. This is not easy to do, so they were not only looking for a heavy person, but a strong person as well. The autopsy showed that Sharon was beaten around her head. She had several bruises on her face and 2 fractures on her jaw, on both sides of her mouth. Her nose was broken and there was a hole in one cheek, probably caused by a tooth that was loosened during the struggle. Most cruel is that Sharon was still alive when her body was dumped. When she was found, she was clutching a branch. The cold case, which had puzzled detectives for 48 years, was solved thanks to new DNA testing techniques and the persistence of Prior's family, who fought to keep her death from being forgotten. The solving of Sharon's case will never bring Sharon back. Doreen Prior, one of Sharon's younger sisters, said at a news conference, but knowing that her killer is no longer on this earth, and cannot kill anymore brings us to somewhat of a closure. Law enforcement investigated more than 100 suspects over the years, but never made any arrests. Yvonne Prior, the teenager's mother, is now in her 80s, still lives in Canada, and has spent her life searching for her daughter's killer. Romine's name didn't come up in investigation until last year. When Longueuil police started looking through criminal records, they found an extensive history of violence and attempts by Romine to evade law enforcement by moving between West Virginia and Canada. Romine first attempted escape from the West Virginia Penitentiary in 1964 and later escaped in 1967. 2 years later, Romine already had a Canadian rap sheet. Romine was living in Montreal at the time. He had a long criminal record, including at least one rape conviction, but was not initially a suspect in her death. He died in 1982 at the age of 36. He matched the description of a suspect, and his car matched tire tracks found at the scene where Sharon's body was recovered. Ultimately, it was DNA evidence found on a man's shirt used to restrain Sharon that confirmed him as the killer. In 1975, the amount of DNA gathered at the scene was insufficient to be tested or used in court, but it was kept over the years in the hope that it could someday be used to find a match for a suspect as technology improved. The samples were sent to a laboratory in West Virginia in 2019 and later matched to Romine's relatives using data from genealogical websites. Once police matched the DNA from the crime scene to the Romine family from West Virginia, investigators met with Romine's brothers to gather their DNA. They determined that theirs was a near match to the genetic material recovered from the crime scene. Next, police exhumed Romine's body in May of this year and tested his DNA against the DNA left at the crime scene. Sarah Bourgoin, the director of the biology and DNA department at Quebec's National Forensic Laboratory, said retrieving a full genetic profile from Romine's bones was a difficult task. "Happily, here it worked," she said. "We were able to establish a genetic profile by comparing it to the unknown profile in Sharon Prior's case. We remarked that it was identical, which confirmed that it was indeed Franklin Romine who left his DNA at the scene." Longueuil Police, the agency that investigated Sharon's death, said the family's dogged pursuit of justice was a key factor that led to them finding the killer. Prior's two younger sisters, Doreen and Maureen, grew emotional as they described Sharon at a news conference. Sharon was a kind, warm-hearted young girl who dreamed of being a veterinarian, the sisters said. "She was a beautiful young lady with a heart of gold," Doreen said. "When she went missing on Easter weekend, the family was distraught. Decades later, they are still scarred by the violence and tragedy of her death," the sisters said. But they thanked the people of Pointe St. Charles for their support over the years as they struggled with her death and all the unanswered questions about the killer's identity. A 36-year-old West Springfield woman who was found dead in her home over the weekend had been stabbed repeatedly, and her death has been ruled a homicide, Fairfax County Police said. The body of Robin Ware Lawrence was found about 12:30 p.m. Sunday by an acquaintance who went to the Contemporary House on Resica Lane to check on her. Lawrence's 2-year-old daughter, Nicole, also was inside and apparently unharmed. Police said that they did not know how long Nicole was left alone, and that an autopsy will be performed to estimate the time of her mother's death. But police spokesman Warren Carmichael said, "We're talking more than a short period of time." The child, who had undergone a liver transplant operation in 1993 at Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh, was taken to Fairfax Hospital for observation and released to her father. Ollie Lawrence, a hospital spokeswoman, said, "Police at the time have not determined a motive in the stabbing, which has shaken a neighborhood that cannot even recall ever having a burglary. At this time, there are a lot of unknowns in this case," Carmichael said. "There are a lot of questions, and we don't have answers." Carmichael said there was no evidence of sexual assault. He would not say how police believe the assailant entered the home, which is on a quiet cul-de-sac in a community called The Crossing, about 2 blocks from West Springfield High School. A neighbor said 2 women brought Nicole to the neighbor's home on Sunday and asked to use the phone to call police. The women said Lawrence's husband, an executive with U.S. Air, was away on business and had been unable to contact his wife by phone. The husband had called the women and asked them to check on her. Ollie Lawrence, vice president of human resources for the airline, was on a business trip in Nassau, Bahamas, a spokesman said. Employed with the company since 1978, he received a Management Achievement Award in 1990. Robin War Lawrence worked at an office of the Merchants Tire and Auto Centers in Manassas. At the nearby Manassas Merchants store, where Lawrence often took her dark gray Nissan 300ZX to be serviced. Employees were stunned to hear about the homicide. "She was just a real sweetheart," said Kevin Berry, the assistant manager at the store. "Everybody in here saw her because she always brought her car in. I don't know why anyone would want to kill her. It's just terrible." DNA was found at the scene, but at the time, there was no match. In 2019, cold case detectives began working with Parabon Nanolabs, a company in Northern Virginia that specializes in DNA phenotyping and genetic genealogy analysis. The company worked to build a family tree to narrow down who the suspect could be. The company uses processes that predict physical appearance and biological relationships from unidentified DNA evidence. Pictures of Stephen Smirk, 51, of Niskayuna, New York, from 1988 and 1998, were found and compared to a digital composite image created by Parabon Nanolabs. Fairfax County detectives traveled to New York, where they obtained a murder confession from Smirk. Police Chief Kevin Davis said, "Smirk was arrested on second-degree murder charges and is awaiting extradition to Virginia." Smirk was a member of the Army in 1994 and was stationed at Fort Myer, now known as Joint Base Myer-Henderson Hall. He has no criminal history, and Davis said, "Smirk is not currently suspected in any other crimes." The murder of Lawrence appears to have been a random act, and no motive was given. This is the story of Donna Macho, a 19-year-old legal secretary, as well as a part-time model. Donna is described as beautiful and was quite popular in high school and college. She resided in the Cherry Brook Lane home in East Windsor, New Jersey. Donna was very hardworking and aspired to be a supermodel, and she was determined to turn her part-time modeling job into a full-time career. It seemed like any other Saturday night in 1984 to then 14-year-old Julie Macho. She arrived at her family's East Windsor home, saw her 19-year-old sister Donna's car parked outside, and went to the basement to hang out with her older sibling. They watched scary movies for hours until 2 a.m., when Julie went upstairs to bed on Cherry Brook Lane. It was the last time anyone from Donna Macho's family saw her alive. Their mother, Betty, and stepfather, Garland, were asleep upstairs. Berger said she never heard any commotion coming from the basement apartment. To this day, Berger doesn't know what happened that night, only that a decades-long nightmare began the following morning on February 26, 1984, when they realized Macho was gone and something was wrong. "The unknown is so destructive," Berger said, reflecting on a crime that not only took her sister, but contributed to the deaths of her mother, stepfather, and older sister Tony. "It destroyed my family. The searching, the looking, the wondering. I lost my family and I lost my future." Investigators soon found Macho's blood-stained car about a mile away, but 11 tortured years passed before her skeletal remains were discovered in April 1995. Wrapped in a carpet in a wooded area near a cranberry farm, not far from where the car was recovered. "We hired private investigators, trackers, psychics," Berger said of the family's effort to find the killer. We spent all the money we had. We still thought that somehow, maybe she was still alive. Maybe she was just hurt, or somebody was holding her. New Jersey authorities announced in May of this year they had finally identified her killer after nearly 40 years of mystery. Advanced DNA analysis of semen found in Donna Macho's basement was matched to Nathaniel Harvey, a convicted killer who had spent time on New Jersey's death row and died in prison 3 years ago. Berger got a call months ago, informing her of the DNA match. Matthew Norden, an investigator with the Mercer County Prosecutor's Office, told her Harvey had been confirmed as her sister's killer. She said it brought her some measure of closure to erase the uncertainty after all these years. But anger soon followed. I was relieved it was going to be closed, but so mad, Berger said. Mad I didn't stay and help her fight. Mad. He could invade our home so easily. Mad he was not in jail. Mad he was dead. He never had to pay for this. Harvey had been locked up since 1985, a year after Macho's killing, when he was charged with the rape and murder of a 37-year-old Plainsboro woman, Irene Schnaps. Over the years, Harvey had been questioned numerous times by police investigating the Macho murder. But there were other suspects as well. And Harvey's DNA tests in the 1980s and 90s had proven inconclusive. Harvey's attorney, Eric Kleiner, has long held that his client didn't kill anyone. And Harvey was still fighting his conviction in the Schnaps killing when he died in prison in November of 2020. Harvey stood trial in 1986 and was convicted of rape and murder in the Schnaps case. On appeal, Harvey claimed he was never given his Miranda rights when questioned by police, and the New Jersey Supreme Court overturned the conviction. In 1994, Harvey stood trial again and was convicted, then sentenced to death. New Jersey abolished the death penalty in 2007, and he appealed once again. The case eventually went to the state Supreme Court, which ordered new DNA testing, and in 2015, Harvey won the right to a third trial on the Schnaps murder. He was 70 and awaiting that trial when he died. Kleiner said this week he couldn't comment because he hadn't seen the DNA test results. Berger, however, said she is relieved that her sister's killer has finally been named. Harvey was living in East Windsor at the time that Macho disappeared. Authorities said he had worked at the farm where Macho's body was found. When all is said and done, his DNA is there, she said, adding she knew Harvey had long been on a short list of suspects. Then I can't see how it could be anyone else who did it. If the DNA is in our house, then he did it. Still questions remain about that fateful night. Was he in the house the whole time? When did he get in? I just don't know, she said. What haunts her most, she said, is her belief that she could have stopped the killer. Berger said her sister was supposed to work at a law firm the Sunday she disappeared, so it wasn't surprising when she wasn't around the house in the day. But when she didn't come home for dinner, her mother grew worried and went downstairs to check the apartment. Berger said there were things were strewn in about Donna's normally tidy apartment. Clear signs there had been a struggle. When her mother found a pile of blood-stained clothes, she called police. Berger said the trauma took an immediate toll on the family. Her stepfather died 6 months after Donna disappeared. She moved to Texas with her mother in 1987, but their storage unit was promptly burglarized, and all their possessions, including the family photos, mementos, and 16 boxes of files regarding the investigation, were stolen. Her mother died in 1990, and her older sister, Toni, died a few years later. They died before Donna's body was discovered. There's something worse than death, and that's a missing child, Berger said. When you have missing child, there's no moving on. Berger said she promised her mother on her deathbed that she would stay on the case, and in the later 1990s, she reached out to Harvey's attorney, hoping to talk to the man. I said, "Let me talk to him," but he wouldn't let me do that, she said. In Texas, Berger said she gradually rebuilt her life, got married and raised 3 kids, while always hoping for a break in the case. Now 54 years old, she's a grandmother and an elected official who serves on council in the town of New Fairview, where she lives. Berger said she periodically would check in with law enforcement in New Jersey to see if there were any new developments in the case. She's also kept in touch with people in East Windsor through the Heightstown High Memorial page on Facebook to keep the investigation alive. "I'm glad the case is closed, and it was him," she said. "But I feel he got away with it." With the investigation over, Berger was finally able to obtain her sister's remains. She was now able to give her sister a proper burial in the family niche. Nearly 35 years after his estranged wife was found dead in the trunk of a car, a 68-year-old man from Oregon has been formally charged with her murder, authorities said. Robert Elmer Atrops was arrested at his Newburgh home on March 2 and charged with 1 count of second-degree murder in connection with the 1988 death of 30-year-old Deborah Lee Atrops, according to a press release from the Washington County District Attorney's Office. In November 1988, Deborah Lee Atrops was reported missing by her husband, then 34-year-old Robert, the release states. Though still married, the couple had separated 5 months earlier and were living together in a Salem apartment with their then 8-month-old daughter. On November 29, 1988, Robert went to pick up the couple's child from a babysitter in Newburgh, while Deborah was at a hair appointment in Tigard. Deborah was reportedly expected to be at the home before 8 p.m., but never showed up. Robert then called several friends and family members to see if they knew where Deborah was, before reporting her missing to the Tigard Police Department, authorities said. The next day, November 30, 1988, he told investigators he still had not heard from his wife. Deborah's car was then entered into databases used by law enforcement as a vehicle connected to a missing person. Deborah's black Honda Accord was reportedly recovered by police officers in Beaverton on December 1, 1988, after a city public works employee reported a suspicious abandoned car with keys in the driver's seat. The 2-door sedan also had its driver's side window down and was missing license plates, authorities said. Police said they found Mrs. Atrops' body inside the car trunk, and it appeared she had been placed there after her death due to the position of her body. Witnesses said they saw the car there in the early morning of November 30, 1988. An autopsy on December 2, 1988, reported that Mrs. Atrops had been physically assaulted and strangled to death. Despite more than 3 decades of investigation, the case eventually went cold. The Washington County District Attorney's Office Cold Case Multidisciplinary Unit reopened the case in 2021. The release states, after receiving a grant from the U.S. Department of Justice, the Cold Case Unit was established in 2020 in partnership with the Washington County Sheriff's Office. For the next year and a half, investigators said they re-interviewed multiple witnesses and had forensic evidence re-examined. The charge against Robert was eventually brought forward on February 28. The grand jury indicted Robert Atrops on 1 count of murder in the second degree. On Thursday, March 2nd, a search warrant was served at Atrops' Newburgh home, and he was taken into custody without incident to the Washington County Jail. 28 years ago, the body of an elderly woman was found dead in her East Greenbush apartment. Wilhelmina Filkins, known to her friends and family as Violet, was found dead in her East Greenbush apartment by her brother Sterling and niece Carol on August 19, 1994. Authorities believe Filkins was killed 2 days earlier during a robbery. Autopsy results show that Filkins died from several blows to the back of her head. 3 years after Filkins was found dead, authorities found personal property belonging to Filkins behind a cemetery along State Route 203 in the village of Nassau. Troopers say the woman lived alone, but was well liked by her neighbors. Authorities say they believed whoever killed Filkins used her car, a white 4-door Plymouth Reliant, to the area to dump some of the stolen property. Back in 2019, police received a tip that sent them to Rosendale, New York. A fingerprint match and a recent tip identified Jeremiah Guyette as the alleged suspect in the death of Wilhelmina Violet Filkins. Police in East Greenbush, south of Albany, said Guyette, who served in the Air Force in Florida and also drove a bus for elderly people, was interviewed after the killing, but never considered a person of interest. East Greenbush Police Detective Sergeant Michael Guadagnino told reporters. An ex-girlfriend later tipped authorities off to Guyette, saying he began crying when he told her he'd robbed a woman and hit her. Guadagnino said, "This can't be true," the ex-girlfriend recalled him saying, according to Guadagnino. "I'm sure she's fine." On October 1, 2019, when Guadagnino and a New York State Police investigator tried to talk to Guyette about the killing, he became defensive and visibly upset, Guadagnino said. Guyette declined to talk with authorities without a lawyer. The next morning, authorities found him dead in the garage of his home in Rosendale, nearly 70 miles south of East Greenbush, Guadagnino said. An autopsy found Guyette took his own life. Investigators then resubmitted all the physical evidence from the original case, including a wooden coffee table with an unknown fingerprint, not knowing if anything would match Guyette. 3 years later, after COVID strained the state crime lab and delayed forensic findings, the fingerprint was determined to match Guyette's left thumb. A tip from a family member last year confirmed Guyette's involvement, Guadagnino said. On October 1, 2019, the same day authorities approached Guyette, he called her in a panic and said he didn't want to go to prison. Guyette told the relative that when he was younger, he planned to rob a bank and steal a car to get money for college. The family member told authorities. Someone had died, but he didn't want to talk anymore over the phone, Guadagnino said. The relative made arrangements for Guyette to meet with a lawyer, a fact authorities confirmed with the attorney. During the news conference, Filkins' niece, Carol Filkins, thanked authorities and recalled her aunt as a simple woman who lived quietly and never would have envisioned anything like this happening. "We're all very thankful it has been resolved," she said. For Sharon Henderson, bringing the killer of her daughter, Nikki Allan, to justice has been an all-consuming, personally ruinous, 3-decade mission. While there was still breath in my body, I would never have stopped until the man who killed Nikki was found, she said. She was last seen skipping to keep up with Boyd, who was a neighbor and her babysitter's boyfriend, as he walked towards the old Exchange building. She disappeared on the night of 7 October with her battered and blood-stained body found in the basement of the nearby old Exchange building the following morning. Nothing mattered more in my life than seeing justice for her. Over these 30 years, I have been through hell. I fought against problems with alcohol, and I've been sectioned in a psychiatric hospital. But I knew I'd get him. One way or another, however long it took, I'd see him locked up. That man was David Boyd, who, for reasons that will never be fully known, battered her head with a brick, rolled up her t-shirt, and stabbed her 37 times. He dragged her body down cellar steps to try to hide her. Local man George Herron fell under police scrutiny, confessing to the crime after 3 days of questioning. But that confession was ruled inadmissible in court due to harsh interrogation tactics, and Mr. Herron was acquitted of Nikki's murder, granted a new identity, and relocated from Sunderland. Henderson says her life has been taken away. I've become estranged from most of my family through this. It's taken over my life. I spent many years drinking to dangerous levels because of this. And since Nikki's death, I've been admitted to psychiatric care. Nikki's family and her killer all lived on the Garths, run-down and now demolished blocks of 1930s maisonettes in Sunderland's East End, near the docks. Henderson's search for Nikki's killer began with trying to track down any man who lived on the estate, whom she had suspicions about. To help her memory, she drew out a map of the block and tried to eliminate each in turn. Eventually, only one person was left. She said, David Boyd. At the time, he was using the surname Smith and also Bell, so no one knew his true identity. Henderson said Boyd, then in his mid-20s, was a friend of her sister's partner, but she had never been able to find anything about his earlier life. He was a young man then, but a loner. The only time I can remember seeing him was when he was out on the veranda in front of the flats on his floor. I don't remember speaking to him. He was there during the police search for Nikki and always hanging around, but after Nikki's death, he left the Garth. She went on a mission to track him down. I made it my business to become friends with his girlfriend and her daughter, and I even moved to Ryhope, a former pit village on the outskirts of Sunderland, to be near them. I wanted to be close to them and find out what they knew about who and where he was. I just knew he had something to do with it. Boyd was spoken to by police as a witness, but never treated as a suspect at the time. A DNA profile matching his was found on Nikki's clothes in 2017 when a new team of detectives reopened the case. She said she had been haunted by relentless nightmares, adding, I kept saying to Nikki that I will not let you down, because I've let you down once and I have to live without you. The judge said Nikki's murder had shocked and bewildered the community of Hendon, in the East End of Sunderland, for 31 years, and as time passed, Boyd would have thought with some relief that he had got away with it. However, the science of DNA had also advanced in the decades since the murder, which allowed detectives to match samples from Nikki's clothes to her killer. Mrs. Justice Lambert said under current rules she would have jailed Boyd for a minimum of 37 years, but she had to comply with the sentencing regulations in 1992, which suggested a lesser sentence, albeit one well in excess of 20 years. Speaking after sentencing, Nikki's mother, Sharon Henderson, 57, said she was absolutely devastated by the sentence, which she labeled a disgrace, adding Boyd should have been jailed for life without the possibility of parole. Nikki's father, David Allan, said he was 28 when Nikki was murdered, and from that night my life changed. In a statement, he said he felt anger and hatred towards the killer and would never be able to forgive the man responsible. Mr. Allan said the devastation he felt was indescribable because Boyd had lived his life for 30 years, whilst Nikki did not get to live hers. The court had heard Boyd was a neighbor of Nikki's in the Waregarth flats. He knew how to navigate the old exchange building and had sexual fantasies about young girls. He also had 22 convictions for 45 offenses, including sexual crimes. In 1986, he exposed himself to a woman. He later told a psychiatrist he had been doing it since the age of 16 and couldn't control the urge. That same year, he was convicted of breaching the peace in Sacriston, County Durham, when he grabbed a 10-year-old girl in a park and tried to kiss her. In 1997, he admitted to police he exposed himself to 3 teenage girls, but was not charged. 2 years later, he groped a 9-year-old girl in a park in Stockton and confessed to a probation officer that he had dirty thoughts and sexual fantasies about young girls. In mitigation, Jason Pitter, for the defense, said Boyd had a history of mental illness, learning difficulties, and an IQ level in the bottom 2% of the population. However, the judge dismissed that as irrelevant because he used sufficient guile to lure Nikki away from her home and was quick to cover his tracks by conjuring a false alibi. She said there was no guarantee Boyd would be released from prison, and it would be up to the parole board to decide. Vicki Johnson's body was found back in January 1991 by investigators at a park on Darwin Street and H Place in Seaside. Police said she was strangled and that her body was set on fire. There were no leads on a suspect, as there were no witnesses to the crime. The case went unsolved for more than 32 years until the State Department of Justice Crime Laboratory found a DNA match underneath Johnson's fingernails matching a man named Frank Lewis McClure. The victim, Vicki Johnson, 34, managed to put up a fight, getting Frank Lewis McClure's DNA under her fingernails. It is an answer, though it is too late to charge the suspect. McClure died at the age of 77 in 2021. Johnson, a mother of 3, was found dead at a horrific scene in the playground area of Sabato Park on January 3, 1991. Seaside is located just east of Monterey, around 115 miles south of San Francisco. Miss Johnson suffered a violent death. She had been strangled, suffocated, and set on fire. Miss Johnson's death shocked the Seaside community due to the details of the brutality. In those days, there was a lot of gang violence, but this one shocked everyone. Seaside Police Chief Nick Borges told Fox News. She wasn't associated with gangs, and to be killed the way that she was. He said that the crack epidemic was insane out here back then. Dealers of the region were exclusively from Seaside and prevalent until the early 2000s. Borges said it is not like that anymore, but he noted the city's somber legacy. It was a violent community. There was a sentiment back then that victims of murder there did not really matter, he said. And to me, that's unacceptable. Every life matters, and we've got to give people justice. Investigators with the Cold Case Task Force, led by the Monterey County District Attorney's Office, reopened the case. They submitted more evidence to the California Department of Justice for DNA testing. It took 2 years for testing because of backlogs and lack of staffing, Borges said. It's really sad. It ties into my frustration with cold cases in general. He voiced frustration with the slow pace of solving the case. He noted that the DNA technology in question is not new. He became chief in August 2021. He added that this testing could have been done 10 years ago. He acknowledged that agencies become overwhelmed with new cases. But he noted a lack of a national standard under which to periodically review unsolved murders. He suggested legislation. We can never allow murders to fall off, he said. Investigators eventually got answers regarding Johnson's death and identified McClure as the suspect. Borges said they managed to identify the suspect because of the DNA under Johnson's fingernails. Evidence clearly demonstrates Mrs. Johnson put up an incredible physical battle against McClure and fought until the last moments of her life. McClure left significant DNA underneath Mrs. Johnson's fingernails, which could only be a result of Mrs. Johnson fighting vigorously for her life. McClure's criminal history dates back to 1990 for crimes, including battery, causing serious bodily injury, and resisting police, the chief stated. The suspect violated probation in 1994 by committing assault with a deadly weapon and domestic violence, and was sentenced to 4 years in prison. In 1991, the year of the murder, McClure committed assault with a deadly weapon and domestic violence, the chief said. Indeed, domestic violence cases were his most common charges, with incidents from 1990, the aforementioned 1991 case, 94, 99, and the most recent in 2011. He has been to prison for assaults with deadly weapons and domestic violence against women, but nothing that rose to the level that would alarm or alert us that this guy would be engaged with murder, Borges told Fox. He was pretty well known in the community, not so much as a great person, but his family was well known, and everyone was fairly surprised. What remains unknown is how Johnson and McClure knew each other, or if they even knew each other at all. Officers also do not know the motive. That's the mystery here, Borges said. Seaside is a small community. Borges suggested that there is a high probability that the victim and the killer would have known of each other at a minimum. The only real link between them is that they both dabbled in illegal drugs, he said. It's really difficult because he's dead, so we may never know. Nonetheless, the investigation is ongoing. Borges voiced hope that someone who knew McClure may step forward the truth. He had to have told somebody what he did, and hopefully that person comes forward. On June 4, 2006, hikers discovered a decomposing body a few miles from Lyons in the South St. Vrain Canyon. Deputies and detectives discovered that the female body appeared to have been pulled from a shallow grave by a predator. Because of the condition of the woman's body, investigators were unable to identify her by her fingerprints. A Boulder man has been arrested in Alaska in connection with a cold case murder dating back to 2006. This is the second time John Angerer has been arrested for the murder of Angela Wilds. Wilds' body was found by hikers in the South St. Vrain Canyon in 2006, about 3.3 miles outside of Lyons in unincorporated Boulder County. Her body was nude except for a cross ring on her left hand. Investigators said the body appeared to have been dragged from a nearby shallow grave, presumably by a large predator. Deputies located a pair of yellow ski pants, a sleeping bag, a pillow in a pillowcase, all neatly folded near the grave. Investigators said there was no information that identified the victim, and she remained unidentified for months. In November of 2006, DNA confirmed the woman's identity as Wilds, who would have been 38 years old. John was initially arrested in 2010, but then released when a judge determined there wasn't enough evidence to link him to the crime. Since then, investigators with the Boulder County Sheriff's Office and the District Attorney's Office have continued to work on the case, including interviewing new witnesses, re-interviewing individuals, consulting with forensic pathologists, and submitting items to the Colorado Bureau of Investigating for testing and DNA analysis. The chief pathologist for the Boulder County Coroner's Office testified at Angerer's probable cause, hearing that there was no evidence in Wilds' autopsy to support a homicide finding. Rather, the pathologist said she had a blocked artery, which meant that she could have died from a heart attack. They need to produce evidence first that Angerer is the person who caused the death of another, public defender Seth Temin said at that hearing. They haven't done that, Judge. They can't even place him at the scene of the death, nor can they say how or where she died. In the end, Boulder County Judge Thomas Reed decided he wanted an appellate court to wrestle with the issue that if there is absolutely no evidence of the cause of death, can a pathologist determine what was most likely the cause of death? The defense attorney lauded the judge's call. "We think this is the right decision," Temin reportedly said after the ruling. "There is no evidence of whether this was a homicide or, if so, who might have done it. That's a fundamental issue in a murder case." In the years that passed, investigators continued their work in determining how Wilds died and who may have done it. They apparently got the same answer by way of the identification of new witnesses, re-interviewing individuals previously known to law enforcement, consulting with other forensic pathologists, and submitting further items to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation for testing and DNA analysis. Specifics about the new evidence were not released. John Angerer was arrested on March 9th in Anchorage. His extradition to Colorado is currently pending. Boulder County Sheriff Curtis Johnson stated, "I am glad that we were able to move our investigation into the homicide of Angela Wilds forward. I am proud that our detectives didn't give up on this cold case. We know Angela's family has been waiting a long time for this day to come. Her family is in our thoughts as we take the next steps in the judicial process." A Long Island cold case more than 4 decades old has finally been cracked, and the identity of the killer is now known. In the kitchen of her Rhode Island apartment, Irene Wilkowitz braced for what the detectives had come to tell her. The last time police had arrived at her door, she was 17, and they told her they'd found her sister's body. Eve, 20, had been kidnapped, raped, and strangled after taking a late-night train home from Manhattan, where she worked as a secretary at a publishing house On March 22, 1980, her body was left in a yard near her apartment in Bay Shore, New York, on Long Island's South Shore. That was 42 years ago. Wilkowitz had since gone to college, worked, married, raised 2 children, divorced, and moved away from Long Island, always in fear that the killer would one day come for her, wondering if they'd ever catch him. She became Eve's last advocate, emailing detectives for updates every few weeks and urging them to try an investigative technique involving DNA that has recently helped crack hundreds of cold cases around the country. The detectives told her they were trying. Now, waiting for their news, she tried not to expect too much. She couldn't bear more disappointment. She took a deep breath. "We identified the person responsible for the death of your sister, Eve," Suffolk County Police Detective Jeffrey Batari said. Wilkowitz's legs began shaking. She hugged her son, Evan, 25, named in Eve's memory. "I started crying because I never thought I'd hear those words," Wilkowitz recalled. His name was Herbert Rice. He died of cancer in 1991, with 2 sons who had no idea what he'd done, Batari said. In the sweeping and exhaustive investigation of the murder, in which police canvassed dozens of streets and interviewed hundreds of people, Rice had never attracted suspicion. He had a short record of arrests for non-violent offenses, which did not require him to provide a DNA sample that would have been put in criminal databases. A query for relatives in the criminal database, known as a familial DNA search, failed as well. It was the new technology, known as genetic genealogy, that finally gave police the answer. Without DNA, this wouldn't have ever been solved, Suffolk County District Attorney Raymond Tierney said. But for Wilkowitz, knowing who killed her sister won't repair 4 decades of terror, anxiety, and loss. "For 42 years, this was all I wanted. I just wanted it to be over," Wilkowitz said. "My goal was to be a mom, and beyond that, I didn't allow myself to dream any other dream, because I was afraid someone would come along and murder me. So I can't process that it's solved now, and that I'm still here." Eve was Wilkowitz's only sibling. Their mother died of cancer before Eve's death, and their father died in 2010, leaving Irene as the last family member who could speak on Eve's behalf. On anniversaries of her death, she did interviews with local media, a way to keep Long Island from forgetting. She wasn't famous. She wasn't a celebrity. "She was my sister, and she matters," Wilkowitz said. In 2018, Wilkowitz's son told her about a new investigative technique authorities in California had used to identify the serial rapist and murderer, known as the Golden State Killer. Police had entered crime scene DNA into consumer DNA databases, including GAD Match, Family Tree DNA, and MyHeritage, and traced the family tree back to a former police officer. The case was the first use of genetic genealogy to solve a violent crime. It led to a surge of interest in the method and spawned a mini-industry of private labs working with genetic genealogists to re-examine decades-old crimes. But the tactic also raised concerns among privacy advocates who feared government misuse of people's personal data, and some states were hesitant to allow its use. In January 2019, Wilkowitz contacted the most famous of the genetic genealogists, Cece Moore, and asked for her help. Moore told Wilkowitz that she couldn't get involved because New York didn't yet allow the technique. The State Department of Health required private labs to obtain a permit to do such work, a rigorous process that can take months or years, and had not granted permission to any lab. The Department of Health has since granted permits to 2 companies to perform genetic genealogy for police in New York. Wilkowitz pleaded with Suffolk County Police Lieutenant Kevin Bauer, a homicide investigator who oversaw Eve's case, to find a way. He, too, was frustrated that he could not try genetic genealogy. But in December 2019, Suffolk County authorities came up with a workaround. They asked the New York Department of Health to let them send DNA from semen found on Eve's body to the FBI. The FBI had helped with the original 1980 investigation and was not restricted by New York laws. The state and the FBI agreed, and in July 2021, an FBI agent specializing in genetic genealogy told Suffolk County detectives she'd found a distant relative of the unknown suspect, along with a last name, Rice. Working on that information, detectives landed on Herbert Rice, who was long dead. Unable to get a DNA sample to confirm their theory, they tracked down one of his sons. After failing to collect a DNA sample from him covertly, Batari, the detective, knocked on the son's door and told him what they were trying to do. The son said he hadn't been close to his father and allowed the detective to swab his cheek, Batari said. The DNA sample verified in late August that the son's father was the killer. Batari told the son and his mother, who filled in more of the story. At the time of the murder, the son's mother said she had kicked Rice out of their house, according to detectives. He had moved in with his mother, who lived about 4 houses from the yard where Eve Wilkowitz's body was discovered on March 25, 1980, detectives said. In the case file, detectives saw that his mother had been questioned by police, who canvassed the neighborhood. She told them she hadn't noticed anything, Batari said. The son had done nothing wrong, but he told detectives he still wished he could apologize to Wilkowitz's family, police said. The son could not immediately be reached for comment. The son's mother declined to comment. On December 6th, Batari and a sergeant from the homicide unit visited Irene Wilkowitz in Rhode Island to tell her what they'd found. Wilkowitz, who works as a nanny, shares an apartment with her son because she remains afraid to live alone. Knowing the chances of a breakthrough were slim, she thought that the detectives were probably coming to say they'd hit a final dead end. She introduced them to Evan and made small talk while Batari used FaceTime to patch in the FBI agent who'd done the genealogical investigation. These are the most exciting kinds of visits we can do, to give a family some sort of answer, Batari said. Especially for her. We had decades of detectives who worked on this. Wilkowitz cried in her son's arms, while the detectives gave her Herbert's name and birth date. They told her how they'd figured it out. It amazed her. She thanked the detectives, and after about 30 minutes, they left. Wilkowitz leaned against her kitchen island for a while, crying. Still shaking, she called Bauer and thanked him. Wilkowitz said she was open to talking to Herbert's son. Batari tried connecting them. The son has told detectives he is considering it. I just want to say thank you, Wilkowitz said, and how sorry I feel for him and his family to know that a family member is responsible for a crime like this. And they have to live knowing that. It's horrible for them as well. Before announcing the case was solved, Suffolk County authorities wanted to make sure they had the right man. So they got a search warrant to exhume Herbert's body. The results came back March 23rd, nearly 42 years to the day Eve went missing. The samples taken from the remains matched the suspect's DNA, Batari said. It was him. There is no way we would have gotten to where we are today had it not been for science and genetic genealogy to let us dig deep, find family members, and get us to Mr. Rice, Suffolk County Police Commissioner Rodney Harrison said. Bauer praised Wilkowitz for keeping attention on the search for the killer. She deserves the credit, and I think she's the star in this case, Bauer said. The case is now closed, but Wilkowitz still suffers from the trauma of losing her sister and of going decades not knowing who killed her. She still has questions that will never be answered. I can't ask him anything. Why did he do it? Why did he pick on an innocent, beautiful woman who was just walking home? Wilkowitz said. There are no real answers. No reason why. She wants to find a way to continue being a voice for her sister, and maybe for the families of other victims whose cases remain cold. To say there is always hope. Her sister wasn't just a story told and retold in the media. "She was a real person," Wilkowitz said. "She was outgoing, had lots of friends, loved horses, loved music, liked to read and write and draw. And she liked to be a big sister to me. I want people to know that." A Florida man who was arrested in connection to the cold case murder of a convenience store manager who was stabbed 73 times nearly 3 decades ago was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison in August of this year. Kenneth Stowe was convicted by an Orange County jury of first-degree murder with a weapon in the death of Terrance Paquette after a 5-day trial. Paquette was supposed to open the store by 6 that morning, officials said. 2 men from an armored car company were there to pick up a cash deposit from the business, but the door was locked. Deputies got keys to the business after one of Paquette's co-workers, who closed shop the night before, drove by, saw authorities, and let them inside with his keys. Paquette was found dead the morning of February 3, 1996, inside the bathroom of the Lil Champ convenience store in northwest Orange County. Pools of blood stained the floor and walls in photos shown by the sheriff's office after the 2021 arrest of the then 54-year-old Stowe. The cash deposit from the store was also missing. Orange County Sheriff John Mena told reporters at a press conference following Stowe's arrest after DNA from a discarded can of beer linked him to the cold case that the scene was very gruesome. Paquette, 31, was the sole employee of the store. Deputies were initially called to the scene after someone noticed the lights were out, even though the store was usually open at the time. Once inside, deputies found Paquette dead from 73 stab wounds. Investigators said blood from Stowe was found throughout the store, including the freezer door, freezer flap, the lottery machine, and the key cylinder and push bar of the entry and exit door. The killer injured himself during the attack and moved around to various parts of the store before fleeing the scene, authorities said. The killer stole Paquette's keys and locked the business after stealing about $1,000 from the safe under the cash register, deputies said. Despite the evidence collected from the scene, investigators lacked the technology then to create a DNA profile and identify a suspect. A detective closed the case on September 29, 1997. Pending further leads. Another investigator reopened it on July 22, 2003, re-interviewing witnesses and taking buccal swabs to compare to the suspect's blood. There were no matches. There were also no matches when an analyst put the unknown DNA profile from the freezer door handle into the combined DNA index database on March 17, 2003. At the time of the killing, there was no way to make an arrest based on blood evidence without comparing it to another blood sample, Mena said. The case went cold and remained that way until 2021, when a droplet of blood recovered from the handle of the store freezer was discovered. It was tested by forensic genealogists with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and determined the blood came from one of 3 brothers. A DNA sample submitted was determined to be a relative of Stowe's parents. He had worked at the convenience store for some time before Paquette and lived in an apartment across the street from him in 1996. Investigators surveilled Stowe and collected DNA from a bag of discarded beer cans, which linked him to the killing. Authorities in Florida have announced they will finally be able to close a cold case murder dating back to 1993 after DNA proved a link to a long-term suspect. Roslin Kruse was just 23 and had last been seen getting into the car of an unknown person on November 1, 1993. Her body was discovered shortly afterwards on the shoulder of East Bay Road in Gibsonton, Florida, which is about 10 miles south of the city center, with an autopsy subsequently revealing she had been strangled to death. It seemed investigators were swiftly making progress when the car was traced to a home in Tampa, and a man named Michael Rizzo admitted to picking Roslin up in his vehicle on the day she died, although he insisted she was alive when he left her. Frustratingly, though, there was nothing concrete to tie Rizzo to the victim, even though his home was less than a mile from the deposition site. His girlfriend gave a conflicting story to his alibi, and he failed a polygraph examination, even though the early investigation showed that he had picked her up on the day of the killing. Rizzo claimed to have dropped her off alive and denied involvement in Kruse's death. And even though a polygraph exam taken at the time indicated deception in his responses, conflicting information from Rizzo's wife and girlfriend at the time further complicated the investigation, according to the sheriff. Ultimately, despite all this circumstantial evidence, detectives were unable to prove their suspicions, and the case slowly went cold. Authorities collected and stored forensic evidence related to the case, including an unknown DNA sample taken from Kruse's body at the time, which did not yield any matches until November 2021. At the time, investigators collected a DNA swab from Rizzo's biological daughter, which matched the DNA profile taken from Kruse's body. Detectives with the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office met with Kruse's relatives after determining the discovery provided a pivotal lead in the case. Investigators verified that Rizzo died on March 1, 2011, in Orange County, Florida, without ever admitting to his crime. This investigation demonstrates the commitment of our cold case investigators to bring justice to victims and their families, no matter how much time has passed, said Sheriff Chad Cronister. We extend our deepest condolences to Miss Kruse's family, and we hope the resolution of this case can provide them with some closure. The investigation has been officially closed by the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office. Authorities in New Mexico have solved a cold case murder dating back nearly 4 decades after funding was provided for DNA testing. Donna Sue Hyatt was last seen alive on a July evening in 1987, with witnesses saying they spotted her leaving a store in Carlsbad with a tall Caucasian male at around 9:15 p.m. When Donna's daughter returned to the family home they shared on Elm Street at around 11:40 p.m., she came upon a terrible scene. Donna lay dead, having been sexually assaulted, stabbed, and strangled. Although investigators followed up as many leads as they possibly could, they could never identify the mysterious man or work out why Donna might have been with him that fateful night. Crime scene technicians collected and preserved the evidence from inside the Elm Street home, but with forensic science in its infancy, there was little that could be gleaned from it. Slowly, the case went cold. Carlsbad police have announced they have been working with a laboratory specializing in DNA technology, and that they have identified a suspect in Donna's killing. They said DNA collected from the 1987 crime scene matches that taken from the exhumed body of a man named Michael Ruff Wigley. What's more, interviews have ascertained that Wigley was in Carlsbad at the time of the murder. During the follow-up investigation, Detective Landgraf and Detective Nice learned Michael Ruff Wigley was investigated in the early 1980s for 2 separate incidents of sexual assault cases in Central Texas. Wigley was charged and convicted in one of those incidents in Texas and was consequently sentenced to prison. Detectives eventually discovered after Wigley was released from prison, he passed away in a traffic accident in 1989. On May 26, 1990, Marlene Warren was having breakfast with her son, Joe Ahrens, when he says a clown approached their front door, carrying a basket of flowers and 2 balloons. Ahrens remembers his mother gleefully answering the door and accepting the apparent gifts, not expecting what she said at that moment. "How pretty," would be her final words. Within seconds, police say, the clown lifted a gun and shot Warren in the head, ending her life and starting a decades-long search for answers. Marlene Warren was someone without any known enemies, said Palm Beach County State Attorney Dave Ehrenberg. This was an assassination. This was not a random act of violence. Immediately after Marlene Warren's shooting, investigators tried to figure out who could possibly want the mother and small business owner dead. They soon focused on her husband, Michael Warren, who was also Aaron's stepfather. Aaron says, based on what his mother had told him, there was good reason. She said, "If anything does happen to me, your father did it," said Aaron's. I told her no way. He would never do anything like that. She said, "Don't put it past him." Investigators learned about a possible motive. Michael Warren appeared to be having an affair with a colleague, Sheila Keene, who repossessed cars at the auto business he ran. In the hours after the murder of Marlene Warren, the suspects became clear, Ehrenberg said. It was Sheila Keene, and it was Michael Warren. But Michael Warren had an alibi. Authorities confirmed that Michael Warren was in a car with friends headed to a horse race at the time Marlene was shot, and he was ruled out as the shooter. When investigators spoke to Keene about her whereabouts, she claimed to be searching for cars to repossess, but was unable to verify her exact location. Detectives also learned a woman fitting Keene's general description was spotted buying a clown costume, as well as the balloons and flowers left by the clown before the murder. When detectives found a car fitting the description given by Aaron's of the assailant's getaway vehicle, they say they found a brown hair that was visually consistent with Keene's hair. Also found inside the car and in Keene's apartment were orange fibers investigators say matched the description of the wig the clown was wearing. Sheila Keene Warren had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to do this, said Ehrenberg. Despite the circumstantial case building against her, Ehrenberg, who did not become the Palm Beach County State Attorney until years later in 2012, says prosecutors at the time did not believe they had enough to charge Keene with Marlene Warren's murder. And as time passed with no new evidence, the case grew cold. For many years, I was suffering in despair, Aaron said. By 2017, there was finally some movement in the case. A cold case unit had retested old evidence and determined Keene's DNA matched the hair found in the suspected getaway car. When investigators started looking for Keene, they learned she had started a new life with an old flame, Michael Warren. The couple got married in 2002, 12 years after the murder. Here's someone whose wife had been murdered and he just married the chief suspect, said Ehrenberg. When you combine the fact that the two of them were in an affair, and then later, they got married, it did seem like mission accomplished. The Warrens had been running a burger joint called Purple Cow for several years in Kingsport, Tennessee. According to former employees at the restaurant, there were rumors Keene Warren had shot Michael Warren's former wife, and that she had committed the crime dressed as a clown. Detectives spoke to one employee who said Keene Warren had dressed as a clown at the restaurant one year during Halloween, and even provided detectives with a picture of her appearing in clown makeup. Sheila Keene Warren was arrested for Marlene Warren's murder on September 26, 2017, 27 years after the shooting. She probably never thought in a million years she'd be held accountable for her crimes, says Ehrenberg about the arrest. She thought she got away with it. Keene Warren's defense attorney Greg Rosenfeld says not only is she not guilty, but her arrest was the result of the Palm Beach County State Attorney's Office's reckless desire to close a notorious cold case. We will never know who killed Marlene Warren because the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office and the State Attorney's Office did such a poor job investigating this case, said Rosenfeld. I can tell you without question that it was not Sheila Keene. Sheila Keene Warren, 59, pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in a deal that will likely see her released from prison in no more than 2 years. Long suspected of being the shooter, Keene Warren has been jailed awaiting trial for first-degree murder since 2017, when Palm Beach County Sheriff's investigators said improvements in DNA technology proved that a hair found in the clown's getaway car came from her. Keene Warren has insisted, however, that she is not the killer. The deal calls for a 12-year sentence, but Keene Warren has already served 6 years awaiting trial. Also, Florida law in 1990 allowed significant time off for good behavior, so Rosenfeld expects her to be released early next year. Nearly 44 years after the stabbing death of an 18-year-old security guard in Sunnyvale, the cold case murder suspect has been identified. In 1979, Estella Elena Mena worked as a security guard in Sunnyvale for a business located at 444 DeGuine Drive, officials said. On October 27th of that year, Sunnyvale officers responded to a report of an assault at the business and located Mena in the lobby, suffering from multiple stab wounds. Deputy District Attorney Rob Baker said county investigators and Sunnyvale detectives used DNA from crime scene evidence that had been uploaded into a national database to conclusively identify Sam Silva of Colorado as the man who fatally stabbed Elena during a rape attempt at her place of work in 1979. Silva died in 2008 in a Colorado prison while serving a sentence on a gun charge. Baker said Silva likely had met Mena previously, when both worked at Great America. Silva and his victim were both 18 years old at the time of their deadly encounter. An office worker had interrupted the attack, causing the suspect to flee. Mena's killer remained unidentified until a new DNA analysis in 2023 by the Santa Clara County Crime Lab of blood on her shoes and clothing in the evidence file from 1979. The blood samples collected at the crime scene enabled the DA's cold case unit to crack the case. Baker said the Estella murder was one of the first cases the cold case unit looked into after District Attorney Jeff Rosen established it in 2011. Baker said that after crime scene investigators collected about 30 items at the scene of the 1979 crime, the only DNA we got was the victim and an unknown male from blood on the doorframe. The DNA from the blood samples were uploaded into the FBI's combined DNA index system CODIS in 2011 and used to create a profile of the suspect, but no match was found. The lab also collected various hairs, and in 2015, the hair samples were sent to the California Department of Justice. These also did not yield any positive identification, Baker said. Not getting any profiles from the evidence tested in 2011 is not surprising since analyzing mixtures and degraded samples was far more challenging back than it is today, the prosecutor said. Then, in 2022, investigators got a big break. The cold case unit used genealogy to identify the source of the doorframe blood and match it to blood on the victim's clothing. Once we identified the source, we used new technology to try and get a profile from the victim's clothing to see if it matched the doorframe guy, Baker said. Much of the victim's clothing was already tested in 2011, so in 2023, we sampled different items and parts that had not been previously tested, knowing that our instruments are more sensitive now. From this exam in 2023, our lab developed Silva's profile, which got a hit with CODIS. Baker said Silva had been staying with family members in Santa Clara County at the time of the killing and fled back to Colorado after the killing. Silva had a criminal history of manslaughter, attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, rape, and firearms offenses. Silva's DNA was collected and uploaded to the CODIS database in 2006, 2 years before his death. DNA technology was not sufficiently developed to identify him before he died. Since 2018, the DA's office cold case unit has solved 16 cold case homicides and 10 sexual assaults. 4 of those murders were solved with the use of forensic genealogy. Once we got the CODIS hit from the victim's clothing, Sunnyvale Public Safety Detective Matthew Hutchison went out to Colorado for several days to conduct follow-up interviews, Baker said. He's been doing traditional investigation, like interviewing witnesses, for several months, and it wasn't until September that Sunnyvale officially concluded Silva was the perpetrator. Investigators identified a 9-year-old girl's killer more than 50 years after she was abducted, less than a block from her Georgia home. 9-year-old Debbie Lynn Randall, 3rd grader, was walking home January 13, 1972, from a laundromat about a half-block away, when she was abducted, raped, and strangled to death. A near citywide search for Randall was initiated and included about 4,000 volunteers. A group of Southern Tech students found her remains 16 days later. Marietta police followed up on hundreds of leads without success. In October 2001, detectives sent a hair removed from Randall's body for DNA testing. The Cobb County Cold Case Unit received the case in 2015. In May of that year, a piece of clothing from Randall was sent for an updated test. Both pieces of evidence were then used to create a partial profile of a suspect. John and Juanita Randall died in recent years without ever knowing who kidnapped, raped, and strangled their daughter after she went across the street from their family's home north of Atlanta, Georgia, to run an errand in 1972. But authorities never stopped pursuing the truth about Debbie's slaying, and in September of this year, their community learned the identity of her killer. By all indications, it was a stranger who ultimately died by suicide, authorities announced, citing the results of an investigation that combined evidence collected shortly after Randall's death, as well as DNA technology. William Rose, who was related to people living in the same apartment complex as Randall's family, had not been a suspect in the case until the DNA technology linked him to Debbie's murder. Debbie's brother, Melvin Randall, stated, "It's a relief to my family that it was no one that we knew. And it's just great that it's over. Maybe we can rest about it and not worry about it, wondering who it was. It's weighed heavy on us for a long time." DNA testing carried out in 2019, made possible by extra funding, and a reanalysis of the cloth in 2022 brought investigators even closer to answers. Further DNA testing last year then brought investigators into touch with people who were probably related to the killer. Those relatives supplied DNA samples to assist authorities, and investigators said that evidence convinced them that Rose had murdered Debbie about 2 years before he died by his own hand at the age of 24. Exhuming Rose from his grave and running DNA testing on his body confirmed investigators' suspicions, Brody said. Ron Alter, a cold case investigator in Brody's office, told reporters that he did not believe Rose knew Debbie Lynn. Alter said what most likely happened was he saw her alone, perceived that to be a chance to abduct her, and acted on the opportunity. "I believe that was a crime of opportunity," Alter said. Alter also made sure to mention his suspicion that Rose, who had prior arrests for alcohol-related cases, killed himself out of fear that he would be imprisoned for Debbie Lynn's murder. Melvin recalled the guilt he carried for years because he was sick the day Rose kidnapped his sister, and he couldn't be at her side when she set out for the laundromat. He told the newspaper that he remembered knocking on neighbors' doors and posting flyers, desperately hoping either would help him and his family reunite with his sister, who loved playing baseball with him. The siblings' father died last year. Their mother died of leukemia in 2018. Despite the losses he has endured, and the painful circumstances around all of them, Melvin Randall said he was not angry with either Rose or his family. "I know they're struggling, going through this too," said Melvin Randall, now a grandfather. "It was tough for us, and I'm sure it's just as tough for them. I wish all of them well, and God bless them, and I don't have any animosity toward them." In the early morning hours of February 20th, 1987, Terry Wood came home from a night of bowling to discover his wife, Roxanne, dead on the kitchen floor in their home in Niles, Michigan. Detectives say Roxanne Wood had been sexually assaulted and her throat slashed. DNA was preserved from the crime scene, but given technological limitations of the time, there wasn't enough evidence to charge any suspects. The case went cold. Then, 34 years later, investigative genetic genealogist Gabriela Vargas got to work on what had been deemed unsolvable by many because of the scant amount of DNA that was left. Roxanne Wood took on a motherly role with her younger siblings, Brad, and Janet. On the evening of February 19, 1987, Roxanne and Terry Wood met at home after work. The couple drove separate cars to a restaurant and had dinner together. Later, they went to a nearby bowling alley where investigators say Terry played in a league. The next day, Roxanne Wood headed home from a night out with friends about 45 minutes before her husband, Terry. When Terry got home, he found Roxanne dead on the kitchen floor. He called local police and said, "My wife has been murdered. She is dead. She has been cut." When investigators from the Michigan State Police arrived at the Wood home, they took photos of the scene, and Terry was questioned by police. Roxanne's body was examined for more evidence. Investigators at the scene found no evidence of forced entry, raising suspicion. According to investigators, Terry also seemed to get belligerent with first responders that night. And when Terry was brought to the station for routine questioning, he quickly asked for an attorney. This set off alarm bells for investigators. Janet Wood stated, an investigator told Terry while looking into Roxanne's murder, "I believe you're the killer, and I will not rest until you're behind bars." Janet Wood says she always knew Terry didn't kill her sister. She added, the possibility of her sister's killer still being out there. "I didn't lose hope ever. I mean, this guy just didn't do this and then lead a clean, pristine life the rest of his life." Due to limitations on technology in 1987, Roxanne Wood's murder case went cold. The Michigan State Police still had a tiny amount of the 1987 DNA evidence from Roxanne's case. In 2020, more than 30 years after Roxanne was killed, they started looking into new ways to solve the case with some innovation. In 2020, Professor Eileen Cotter and students at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, Michigan started helping the Michigan State Police with the Roxanne Wood case. The students digitized more than 3,500 pages from the 1987 case file, making it quicker and easier to search through evidence for information. The officers are able to search by name and see if they've already been interviewed, said student Samantha Rogers. Things that they wouldn't be able to do just flipping through thousands of pages. Detective First Lieutenant Chuck Christensen took the investigation a step further and reached out to genetic genealogist and president of Identifinders International, Colleen Fitzpatrick. Her company helps identify unidentified remains and people involved in violent crimes by looking at their DNA. In 2020, Identifinders International started looking into the unidentified DNA left from Roxanne's case. We found out there was, what I would call, a gnat's eyebrow of DNA left, about 3% of what we normally use, said Colleen Fitzpatrick. It really did feel impossible. After about 10 months of testing the small amount of DNA left to solve the Roxanne Wood case, Colleen Fitzpatrick discussed the case with Identifinders International consultant, Gabriela Vargas. After months without success, Fitzpatrick didn't want to disappoint investigators. Vargas looked at the case file and generated a genetic profile from the killer's trace DNA. She then entered the DNA information into an online database. In April 2021, Gabriela Vargas used the online DNA database to start building a family tree of the suspect. That family tree led to a man named Patrick Gilham, who was living in South Bend, Indiana, not far from where Roxanne Wood was killed. Investigators surveilled Gilham with the hope of collecting his DNA. While undercover, Trooper Ryan Codd noticed Gilham was a smoker and knew a cigarette would be a great source for a DNA sample. Trooper Codd picked up Gilham's cigarette after having a conversation with him outside of the laundromat. On July 29, 2021, investigators brought Patrick Gilham in and interviewed him. They told him he wasn't in trouble and that they needed to question him about an old case. Detectives showed Gilham photos of Roxanne and told him she was assaulted. They asked him questions about Roxanne, but Gilham denied knowing her. Soon he said, "I gotta talk to my lawyer, man," and investigators let him go. On February 17, 2022, Patrick Gilham, 67, was arrested and questioned for more than 5 hours. When asked why his DNA was found at the scene, he kept telling investigators, "I have no clue, and I don't remember." Gilham asked for an attorney at the end of interview. He pleaded no contest to second-degree murder, and on April 25, 2022, Gilham was sentenced to a minimum of 23 years in prison for the 1987 murder of Roxanne Wood. Detective John Moore said up until Gilham's arrest, Terry Wood was considered a person of interest. For 35 years, he labored under false assumptions that he murdered his wife. I'd heard stories that at times he'd walk into a place and somebody would call him Slash, said Detective Jason Bailey. Roxanne's brother Brad Woods was only 14 when his sister was murdered. He says he couldn't believe the day when they finally found the guy who killed his rock. It didn't seem real. You know, it was nothing like I had ever played in my mind of how I would be when they came to the door to say, "We've got him." A man in 1987 was almost convicted for the murder of a 6-year-old boy in Solano County. Officials said DNA technology not only proved him innocent, but led investigators to crack the cold case 36 years later. Jeremy Stoner was kidnapped near his Vallejo home and found dead 4 days later on Sherman Island in Sacramento County. Sherman Island is about 36 miles east of Vallejo, along the Delta. An autopsy showed the boy was also sexually assaulted, the Solano County District Attorney's Office said. Investigators originally suspected Sean Melton in 1987, charging him with murder and kidnapping, because he appeared to have knowledge only the person responsible for the child's death would know. But his case was dismissed after a jury could not reach a verdict. It turns out those juries got it right. A different man, Fred Kane, 69, has now been charged with kidnapping and murdering Jeremy. It's unfortunate that Mr. Melton was tried for a crime he did not commit, Abrams said. The prosecutor said DNA technology that was not available decades ago has tied Kane to the killing. It's such an important tool because it can not only solve crimes, like we believe it solved this one, but it can also exonerate somebody who's innocent. But Melton, the original suspect, died in 2000 without being able to be here to know he's exonerated, Abrams said. It turns out Kane, the current suspect, was interviewed by police shortly after the kidnapping. But that same day, Melton, a self-styled investigator, walked into the Vallejo Police Department with theories about the case. He was either an investigator or private investigator, or a wannabe investigator, but he really wanted to help solve this case, Abrams said. But instead, Vallejo police quickly zeroed in on Melton. They lost their objectivity to fully investigate the case. They just became personally involved, said Peter Four, who was Melton's public defender and later became a judge. Fred Marion Kane, the man charged with murdering 6-year-old Jeremy Stoner in Vallejo, is now being investigated by police for a second cold case in Martinez. Kane, 69, was arrested on September 18th at his Gold Hill, Oregon home, and he remained in custody. 9-year-old Eric Coy was riding a bicycle around his Martinez neighborhood when he was kidnapped on January 24, 1987. His body was found the following day in a stream by Martinez Junior High School in Contra Costa County. Eric's killer stabbed him nearly a dozen times, according to investigators. The boys were kidnapped and slain within weeks of each other, and for 36 years, their killer's identity remained a chilling mystery. In September of this year, another major new development surfaced. Martinez Police Lieutenant Patrick Salamid stated that Kane is now considered a person of interest for Eric's death. Citing legal reasons, Salamid would not go as far calling Kane a suspect in the Eric Coy case. "It's nice that hard work pays off," said investigator Kevin Coelho, a former Vallejo police officer. "We can't bring Jeremy back, Absolutely horrible what the family's gone through for the last 37 years. If you enjoyed the video, please show your support by subscribing and liking the video. And turn on all notifications so you don't miss any future uploads.